The first truck arrived at 4:43 inches the morning. Elias Mercer knew the exact time because the vibration shook the glass in the kitchen cabinet and woke him before the engine reached the gate. At 67, he had learned to sleep through wind, thunder, and the coyotes that called from the tree line, but he could never sleep through those trucks. Their engines carried across the fields like distant machinery in a war. Elias pulled on his work coat, stepped into his boots, and walked outside without turning on the porch light. The July air was already warm. Beyond the barn, two white headlights moved slowly along the dirt access road that cut across the northern edge of his property. A second truck followed, then a third. The mill had started coming before sunrise because fewer people were awake to see what it was doing. Elias crossed the yard and stopped beside the rusted fence. The first driver reversed toward a low section of pasture where sweet corn had once grown shoulder high. The truck bed lifted. A gray-brown wave of sawdust, bark, wood chips, and wet fibrous sludge slid onto the land. The load hit the ground with a heavy, muffled collapse. Steam rose from its center. The driver lowered the bed, never leaving the cab. For 23 years, Elias and his wife, Ruth, had used that field for corn, beans, and winter squash. She had known every low spot where rain gathered and every ridge where the soil dried first. After she died, Elias stopped planting the northern field for 2 seasons. He had not abandoned it. He simply had not been ready to work there without her. The mill apparently saw the empty ground differently. To them, unused meant available. The company had begun with a single load 3 months earlier. A supervisor named Wade Collins had appeared at Elias's door carrying a clipboard and an easy smile. He explained that the material was mostly wood residue, natural, harmless, temporary. It'll break down on its own, Wade had said. Elias had asked why the mill did not let it break down on its own property. The smile disappeared. After that, the loads came twice a week. Then, every other day. Now trucks arrived before dawn. By sunrise, the pile stood higher than Elias's tractor. Fresh sawdust covered the surface in pale yellow streaks. But the material underneath was darker and wetter. Rainwater collected at its base, carrying brown liquid through the grass. Wherever that water traveled, the pasture changed. Some patches turned yellow. Others went black and soft beneath his boots. The smell was not the clean scent of cut lumber. It was sour, heated, and strangely sweet, like wet cardboard sealed inside a metal drum. Elias took photographs. He wrote down license plates. He marked the edge of each new load with wooden stakes. He called the county twice. The first official told him it was a civil disagreement. The second said the material did not appear hazardous based on the mill's paperwork. Paperwork. Elias looked across the field at thousands of pounds of material nobody had tested in his soil, under his rainfall, beside his well. The drivers began pulling away. One of them slowed near the fence. He was young, no older than 25. For a moment, he and Elias looked directly at each other. The driver lowered his eyes and kept going. Elias waited until the sound of the engines faded. Then he climbed through the fence and approached the newest pile. The surface shifted beneath his boots. Near the bottom, where old bark met damp grass, a thin cloud of vapor curled into the morning air. Elias crouched and pressed his bare hand against the material. The outside was cool. He pushed deeper. The heat inside was strong enough to make him pull back. Elias stared at his palm. The pile was not simply sitting there. Something inside it was working. He leaned closer and noticed white threads spreading through a piece of rotting bark. Tiny mushrooms had appeared beneath the shaded edge. A cluster of earthworms twisted in the dark soil, where the oldest material had begun to crumble. 3 months of anger had taught Elias to see only damage. But that morning, for the first time, he saw movement, heat, fungus, decomposition, life gathering at the edge of what the mill had called waste. He picked up a handful of the darkest material It no longer looked like sawdust. It broke apart between his fingers, like rough forest soil. Behind him, another engine sounded on the county road. A fourth truck was coming. Elias closed his hand around the material and stood. The mill believed it was burying his land. It had no idea what it was delivering. By 8 o'clock, the trucks were gone. What they left behind covered nearly half an acre. Elias stood at the edge of the northern field with a measuring tape, a notebook, and the same sharpened pencil Ruth had once kept behind her ear during harvest. He recorded the length of the newest pile, its height at the center, and the distance between the runoff line and the shallow ditch that led toward his well. Numbers gave him something anger could not. A record. The mill could call the material harmless. The county could call it a private dispute. But Elias intended to know exactly how much had been placed on his land, and where every gallon of brown water traveled after rain. He walked toward the old corn rows, though almost nothing remained of them now. A few broken stalks still stood near the fence, gray and hollow from the previous winter. Ruth had planted corn there every May for more than 2 decades. She never began with the seed. She began with the soil. She would kneel, push 2 fingers into the ground, and lift a small handful toward her face. "Too wet," she might say. Or, "Give it 3 more days." Elias used to tease her for talking as if the field could answer. After 42 years beside her, he understood that it had. Ruth had died 18 months earlier, after a long illness that reduced their world to hospital corridors, medicine schedules, and bills stacked beneath a ceramic bowl on the kitchen table. Elias sold 23 cattle to cover the first round of treatment. He sold the baler before the second. By the time the hospital stopped calling, the farm had become smaller in every measurable way. Fewer animals, less equipment, less money. Only the land remained unchanged. That was why Wade Collins had chosen the northern field. The mill supervisor knew Elias was vulnerable. Everyone in the county knew. Small towns protected privacy and conversation but traded it freely in parking lots, diners, feed stores, and bank offices. Wade had first offered to purchase the field, not the whole farm, only the northern section adjoining the mill's access road. The offer was far below what Elias believed the acreage was worth, but Wade presented it as a favor. "You're not using it," he had said. Elias remembered the way the man glanced toward the house, as if calculating how many rooms an old widower truly needed. "It hasn't been planted for 2 years," Wade continued. "You could clear some debt? Make life easier." Elias had refused. 3 weeks later, the first truck arrived. The mill claimed it had permission under an old access arrangement signed by Elias's father in 1978. The document allowed temporary passage for timber crews working near the property line. It said nothing about dumping. Elias knew that, but knowing and proving were different things. A lawyer in town asked for a $5,000 retainer just to begin reviewing the dispute. Elias had $916 in his farm account. The county office advised negotiation. The mill advised patience. The bank advised selling. Everyone offered advice that required Elias to surrender something. That afternoon, he drove his tractor toward the southern pasture to repair a broken gate. The machine coughed twice before starting. Its faded red hood was patched with rust, and the seat had split along one side. Ruth used to say the tractor sounded worse than it worked. The southern pasture was thin but usable. 6 cattle grazed near the creek. All that remained of the herd, he and Ruth had spent 30 years building. Each animal carried bloodlines selected for calm temperament and the ability to survive rough winters on poor forage. Elias could have sold them. He could have sold the house, the barn, and every acre that held a memory sharp enough to hurt. But selling the northern field would not simply reduce the farm, it would break it. The field sat between the access road and the lower cropland. Whoever controlled it controlled the easiest route across the property. Once the mill owned that strip, trucks could move farther south. Storage piles could become permanent. The remaining land would lose value, and the well would sit downhill from an industrial waste site Elias could no longer enter. Wade called it an unused field. Elias saw the hinge holding the farm together. Near sunset, he returned to the newest pile and drove 3 metal posts into the soil around it. On each post, he painted the date, July 18. He photographed the runoff again, then collected dark liquid in a clean mason jar. He labeled it and placed it beside 3 others in the barn. Ruth had taught him that a field answered slowly. You had to keep listening. As the light faded, Elias noticed something beside the oldest waste pile. A narrow strip of grass there was not dead. It was greener than the rest of the pasture. He crouched and touched the soil beneath the surface. It was cool and damp. The mill had chosen his weakest moment to take the field from him. But it had made one mistake. It assumed that because Elias was old, tired, and alone, he had stopped observing. The green strip beside the oldest pile bothered Elias more than the dead grass. Dead grass made sense. Brown runoff. Smothered roots. Too much wet material pressed against the soil. Those were visible causes with visible damage. But the narrow line of green had no obvious explanation. It ran along the eastern edge of the pile, no wider than a shovel blade, where rainwater had seeped through the material and entered the pasture. The grass there stood taller than the rest, dark and upright, despite 2 weeks without meaningful rain. Elias returned the next morning with a spade. He cut into the green strip first. The topsoil came apart easily. Beneath it, the ground was darker than the dry pasture, several yards away. Fine roots spread through the layer like threads. When he squeezed a handful, it held together for a moment before breaking apart. Then he dug into the yellow grass nearby. That soil was hard, pal, and dry enough to crumble into dust. The difference was too sharp to ignore. Elias marked both places with stakes. He took samples from the green strip, the dead patch, the untouched pasture, and the base of the oldest waste pile. Each went into a separate jar. He wrote the date, location, smell, color, and moisture level on masking tape. He had no laboratory, but he had spent most of his life comparing one field against another. Farming had taught him that truth often appeared first as a difference. One row emerged faster. One cow avoided a corner of pasture. One low place stayed green 3 days longer than the hill. The mistake was not failing to know the answer immediately. The mistake was failing to notice the question. By noon, the sun had warmed the surface of the waste pile. Elias climbed halfway up and pushed a steel fence post into the material. When he pulled it out, the lower half felt hot. He fetched the long compost thermometer Ruth had bought years earlier at a farm auction. The glass face was scratched, and the red needle stuck briefly when he tapped it. He inserted the probe 3 feet into the pile. The needle rose past 100 degrees, then 120. It stopped near 138. Elias checked again from another side. 141. The air temperature was 86. He stood beside the pile, staring at the dial. The heat was not coming from sunlight. It was being produced inside. He broke open a compacted section with the tractor bucket. A cloud of warm vapor escaped. Beneath the dry outer crust, the sawdust had changed color. Pale chips had become brown. Bark peeled apart in his hands. White fungal strands spread across the damp wood in branching patterns. It looked less like rot than construction. Something was dismantling the material piece by piece. Elias filled 2 buckets from different depths. One came from the fresh yellow layer near the surface. The other came from the older, darker cinder. The fresh material smelled sharp and woody. The older material smelled warm, earthy, almost sweet. He carried both to the barn and set them beside Ruth's gardening books. Most of the books were practical volumes with stained covers, vegetable diseases, pasture grasses, livestock nutrition, preserving food. Near the bottom of the stack, he found a thin manual on composting. Ruth had underlined one sentence in blue ink. A compost pile was not a heap of dead material. The book explained. It was a managed population of living organisms. Elias read the line twice. The pages described how microbes consumed carbon-rich materials, using nitrogen to build cells and releasing heat. As they worked, too much carbon slowed the process. Too much water pushed out oxygen. Dense material could turn sour. Proper balance transformed the pile. He looked through the barn door at the waste rising above the field. The mill had created the pile accidentally. It had supplied carbon in enormous quantities. Rain had supplied moisture. Old grass and soil beneath the load had supplied some nitrogen and microorganisms, but the pile had no balance. No mixing. No drainage. No control. That explained the heat. It might also explain the sour smell and the damaged grass. Elias opened Ruth's old field notebook and drew 4 columns. Fresh sawdust. Aged material. Soil beneath pile. Grass response. For the next 6 days, he measured temperature every morning and evening. He recorded rainfall, odor, moisture, and the appearance of fungi. He placed a handful of fresh material in one bucket, aged material in another, and ordinary soil in a third. Then he planted bean seeds in each. The beans in ordinary soil emerged first. The seeds in fresh sawdust swelled, then stopped. But in the bucket containing aged material mixed with soil, 3 pale shoots pushed through the surface. They were weak. They were uneven. But they were alive. Elias carried the bucket to the porch and placed it where he could see it from the kitchen window. For months, the mill's waste had represented only invasion. Now it represented a process. Unfinished, unstable, and dangerous when handled carelessly but not useless. That evening, another truck entered the access road. Elias watched it approach without reaching for his camera. This time, he reached for his notebook. The mill was still dumping waste on his land. But Elias had begun to understand what the mill itself did not. The bean shoots survived for 9 days. Then the leaves began to pale. Elias moved the bucket from the porch into the barn and set it beside the others. The plants in ordinary soil were short but green. The ones growing in aged mill material had emerged quickly, then seemed to lose strength. He pulled one plant carefully from the bucket. Its roots were thin and poorly branched. The material held moisture. It had begun to break down, but something was still missing. Elias returned to Ruth's compost manual and read beyond the sections she had underlined. The explanation was simple enough to understand and difficult enough to manage. Wood was rich in carbon. The organisms breaking it down needed nitrogen. Without enough nitrogen, decomposition slowed. Worse, microbes could temporarily compete with plants for the nitrogen already present in the soil. That was why the beans had sprouted and then weakened. The material was not empty. It was hungry. Elias wrote the sentence in his notebook. Carbon waiting for nitrogen. The phrase changed the way he looked at the piles. The mill had delivered thousands of pounds of one side of a biological equation. Sawdust, bark, and chips could provide structure and carbon, but they could not become fertile soil alone. They needed moisture, air, nitrogen, and time. Fresh waste placed directly over a field was not finished compost. It was unfinished work. Elias began collecting what the farm still produced. He scraped manure from the cattle shelter. He gathered spoiled hay from behind the barn. He cut tall weeds before they formed seed and loaded them into the tractor bucket. From the kitchen, he saved vegetable peelings and coffee grounds. None of it was enough. The mill's piles were too large. He drove 3 miles east to visit Nora Bell, who kept 40 dairy cows on land. Her family had farmed since before Elias was born. A mound of manure sat behind her loafing barn, mixed with straw and wasted feed. Nora listened without interrupting as Elias explained the heat, the fungi, the weak bean plants, and the need for nitrogen. "You want my manure?" she finally asked. "I want what you're paying to move." Twice a year. Nora hired a contractor to haul away the excess. She agreed to let Elias take several loads, provided he did the hauling himself. By sunset, he had built his first deliberate pile. He laid down coarse branches for airflow. Over them, he spread a layer of aged wood waste. Then manure. Then green weeds and spoiled hay. He watered each layer lightly, before adding the next. The pile measured 12 feet long, 6 feet wide, and nearly 5 feet high. It looked crude, but unlike the mill's heaps, every part of it had a purpose. Elias pushed the compost thermometer into the center. 78 degrees. The next morning, it read 96. By evening, 117. On the third day, the needle passed 130. Steam rose when he opened the pile with a fork. The smell was different from the sour runoff near the dumping site. It was strong, but not rotten. The manure odor had softened. The wood smelled damp and warm. Elias turned the pile to bring the outer material inward. The work was harder than he expected. His shoulders burned. His lower back tightened each time he lifted the fork. By the time he finished, sweat had soaked through his shirt, and his hands shook around the handle. At 67, every experiment had a physical cost. He sat on an overturned bucket until his breathing slowed. For a moment, the scale of the problem overwhelmed him. One balanced pile would not reclaim half an acre. It would not stop the trucks. It would not pay a lawyer or repair the northern field. Then he looked at the material he had turned. The pale sawdust was already darkening where it touched the manure. The process was faster now. Not because he had discovered a miracle, but because he had supplied what the waste lacked. For the next 3 weeks, Elias kept records. When the pile became too wet, he added dry chips. When it cooled too quickly, he turned it. When the center dried, he added water. He learned to judge moisture by squeezing a handful. It should hold together briefly. Ruth's book said, but should not drip. The pile became less like a mound and more like a living machine. One morning, Wade Collins found him working near the fence. The mill supervisor stepped out of his truck and watched Elias load aged material into the tractor bucket. "You planning to spread that on your crops?" Wade asked. "Not yet." Wade glanced at the thermometer and the rows of labeled stakes. "You're wasting your time. That stuff has no agricultural value." Elias rested both hands on the fork. "Then you won't mind if I keep it?" Wade's expression tightened. "That isn't what I said." It was the first time Elias understood that the mill's position depended on a contradiction. The material had no value when it damaged his land, but it might become company property the moment he made it useful. After Wade left, Elias returned to the pile. He dug into the center and lifted a handful. The sharp edges of the chips were softening. The material was dark, varm, and threaded with white fungal growth. He closed his hand around it. The mill had delivered carbon. The cattle had supplied nitrogen. The rain had supplied moisture. The air entered each time he turned the pile, and time was beginning to do the rest. Elias waited 6 weeks before using the first batch. By then, the pile had lost almost half its height. The sharp smell had faded, and the hottest days were behind it. What remained was darker than the original sawdust, softer beneath the fork, and cool enough to handle. To Elias, it looked ready. He spread it across a 1/4 acre near the barn. The plot had once grown feed corn, but years of shallow tillage and summer heat had left the soil tight and pale. Elias worked the compost into the top few inches, then planted 3 rows of corn and 2 rows of beans. He marked the plot with a white stake. Test 1. For the first week, everything appeared normal. The seeds germinated. Thin green shoots broke through the surface. Elias checked them every morning. Sometimes, before he fed the cattle, he measured the height of 10 plants and wrote the average in Ruth's notebook. On day 11, the corn began to change. The lower leaves lost their deep color. Green faded to yellow, starting at the tips and moving inward. The beans slowed next. Their stems remained thin, and several leaves curled along the edges. Elias watered. Nothing improved. He dug beside one corn plant and examined the roots. They were shorter than those in the untreated soil, and surrounded by fragments of wood that had not fully decomposed. The material had looked like compost. It was not finished. The organisms breaking down the remaining wood were still consuming available nitrogen. Elias had added fertility to the field, but the unfinished carbon was tying up part of it before the crop could use it. He had understood the principle. He had misjudged the timing. Within another week, nearly half the corn had turned pale. That was when Wade Collins arrived. He parked beside the access road and walked toward the plot with his phone already in his hand. "Is this the field you amended with our material?" he asked. Elias did not answer. Wade stepped between the rows and photographed the yellow plants. "You should have listened," he said. "This is exactly why the mill doesn't recommend agricultural use." "You didn't recommend anything," Elias replied. "You dumped it." Wade ignored the distinction. By afternoon, photographs of the failed plot had reached the county office. A local feed store clerk told Elias that mill employees were saying the old farmer had spread industrial waste on his crops and ruined them himself. The story changed quickly. The land was no longer being damaged by the mill. Now Elias was the reckless one. For 2 days, he avoided the northern field. He fed the cattle, repaired a broken water line, and left Ruth's notebook closed on the kitchen table. Each time he passed the window, he could see the pale rose near the barn. The failure embarrassed him more than he expected. He had not told anyone that the system would work, but privately, he had begun to believe he was already close. The yellow corn proved otherwise. On the third morning, Elias pulled every plant from one section of the plot. He separated the roots from the soil, laid them on a sheet of plywood, and compared them with plants from untreated ground. Then he took samples from the compost pile at 3 depths. The outer layer still contained recognizable chips. The center had decomposed more fully. The bottom was dense, wet, and sour. The pile had never been uniform. Elias had judged the entire batch by the best material near the center. That was his mistake. He returned to the manual and found 3 words he had skimmed past before. Curing takes time. A pile could stop heating before it became stable. Material that looked dark and earthy could still continue decomposing. If applied too soon, it might compete with crops, carry excessive salts, or create uneven conditions in the soil. Elias wrote a new rule in the notebook. Do not trust appearance alone. He divided the remaining material into smaller piles. He mixed the wet bottom sections with dry chips. He turned everything again and left it to cure. Then he changed the experiment. Instead of planting directly into the compost, he prepared 6 narrow beds. 1 received untreated soil, 1 received fresh sawdust, 1 received partially composted material, 1 received fully aged material from the oldest pile, 1 received aged material mixed with manure. The last received only a thin layer of mature compost on the surface. He planted the same number of bean seeds in each bed. This time, he was not trying to prove himself right. He was trying to discover exactly where he had been wrong. 2 weeks later, the differences became visible. The fresh sawdust bed performed worst. The partially composted bed emerged unevenly. The aged material did better. But the strongest plants grew where the mature compost had been used lightly, without being mixed deeply into the soil. Elias knelt between the rows and studied the leaves. The waste was not a fertilizer that could be applied by the truckload. It was an ingredient. Too fresh. It competed with the crop. Too wet. It turned sour. Too concentrated. It overwhelmed the soil. Used carefully, after enough time, it supported life. The failed corn remained standing at the edge of the plot for another month. Elias did not remove it. He wanted the yellow rows where he could see them. They reminded him that observation without patience could become another form of arrogance. The mill believed the dead plants proved the material was useless. Elias saw a more valuable lesson. He had not failed because the idea was wrong. He had failed because living systems refused to follow his schedule. Elias stopped trying to save the entire field at once. That decision changed everything. Until then, every new truckload had felt like another acre lost. Another problem, expanding faster than one old man could contain it. The failed corn had shown him the danger of working at the scale of his anger. So he made the problem smaller. One pile, one bed, one measured change at a time. He divided the oldest material into 4 working areas. Fresh loads remained near the access road. Material that had begun to decompose went beneath the open-sided shed. Stable compost was shaped into low-curing rows. Coarse bark and wood chips were stacked separately for mulch. On scrap boards, he painted 4 signs: fresh carbon, active compost, curing, ready for field. The system looked primitive beside the mill's steel loaders and towering stockpiles. Elias had a rusted tractor, a manure fork, a damaged thermometer, and Ruth's notebook. But the mill measured success by how quickly residue disappeared from its property. Elias measured success by what the material became. He no longer mixed anything without a reason. The tractor bucket handled most of the turning now. Elias used the fork only to open compacted edges and pull dry material into the center. His back still tightened by noon. But he had stopped treating exhaustion as proof of progress. Each pile had to earn the next sign. Fresh material could not move into active compost until Elias knew where it came from. Active compost could not enter the curing rows until the sour smell was gone and the material had changed evenly. Nothing reached the field simply because it looked dark. Appearance had fooled him once. It would not fool him again. Nora Bell brought 2 more loads of manure. In exchange, Elias repaired a broken gate and promised to return finished compost for her garden. The restaurant in town began saving vegetable scraps in sealed barrels. The first load contained wilted lettuce, coffee grounds, carrot tops, plastic wrappers, 3 forks, and a broken drinking glass. Elias returned the entire barrel. The owner stared at him from the restaurant doorway. Most of it was usable. Most isn't enough. It all came from the kitchen. So did the glass? The next barrel arrived clean. That became another rule. Nothing entered the system unless someone was willing to separate it properly. The mill's material was harder to judge. Some loads contained clean sawdust and bark. Others held dark fragments that Elias could not identify. One morning, he found strips of laminated board buried beneath a fresh layer of chips. The edges were swollen from rain, and a chemical odor rose when he split one open with a shovel. He marked the pile with red stakes. Do not use. Wade Collins arrived before noon. He stepped from his pickup and looked at the sign. You don't get to reject individual loads. They're on my land. They're mill residuals. That piece isn't bark. Wade glanced at the broken board. It came through the same process as everything else. That doesn't make it safe. You're not qualified to make that determination? Then neither are you. Wade looked toward the organized rows beneath the shed. You've been processing company material for your own benefit. Elias rested one hand on the tractor fender. For months. You said it had no value. It may have value after proper treatment. Who treated it? Wade did not answer. The contradiction had become impossible to hide. When the material damaged the pasture, the mill called it harmless waste. When Elias separated it, aged it, and made it useful, the mill began calling it property. Wade pointed toward the red-staked pile. You move that load, and we'll consider it interference with company operations. Elias picked up the shovel. I'm not moving it. He drove another red stake into the ground. I'm making sure it never reaches food. For the rest of the afternoon, the pile remained where it was. So did the sign. By late September, Elias had one batch he trusted enough to test again. It had spent weeks in the curing row after the active heating ended. It no longer reheated when gathered into a mound. Most of the original wood had lost its shape. The material smelled earthy, held moisture without becoming slimy, and crumbled when pressed. He did not spread it across a field. He prepared one narrow bed beside an identical strip of untreated soil. Across the first bed, he spread a thin layer of mature compost and covered the spaces between the rows with aged wood chips. The second bed received nothing. He planted spinach, radishes, and winter lettuce in both. For several days, the beds looked nearly identical. Then the weather turned dry. The untreated soil hardened at the surface. Several seedlings wilted before sunset. In the treated bed, the ground remained darker beneath the mulch and loose enough for Elias to press a finger into it. The plants were not perfect. Insects damaged several leaves. Some radishes failed to form. One section germinated poorly, but the bed stayed alive. A week later, Elias cut the first lettuce and carried it into the kitchen. He placed the basket beside Ruth's notebook. It was not enough to feed a family for long. It would not restore the northern field or stop the trucks. But it proved that the process could be completed. Waste had become compost. Compost had protected soil. The soil had held water, and the damaged land had produced food again. Outside, the mill continued running through the night. Its machines turned trees into lumber. On the other side of the fence, Elias was building a different kind of mill, one that did not measure what it could discard. It measured what could safely be brought back to life. The lettuce did not impress anyone. Not at first. To Elias. The basket on his kitchen table represented months of observation, failure, and controlled change. To everyone else, it was a small harvest from a narrow bed beside an old barn. Nora Bell took one head home. The restaurant owner accepted 2 crates. A neighbor bought a bundle of radishes and joked that Elias had become the county's most expensive gardener. Elias did not argue. He knew one successful bed proved very little. The soil beneath it had been protected by mature compost and mulch. But the northern field remained uneven, compacted, and scarred by runoff. Some areas stayed wet for days. Others dried into hard crusts. The largest waste piles were still too fresh to use safely. If he wanted to prove the system worked, he needed more than vegetables. He needed a comparison that could survive an entire season. In early spring, Elias selected 2 adjoining plots, each measuring 1/4 acre. Both had the same slope, similar soil, and equal exposure to the sun. He left the first plot unchanged. On the second, he spread a thin layer of fully cured compost, then covered the soil between planting rows with aged wood chips. He did not bury fresh material. He did not add more than the soil could absorb. He planted both plots with the same crops on the same day: beans, potatoes, winter squash, cabbage. He measured seed spacing with a length of knotted rope. Each plot received the same amount of irrigation during the first month. Elias recorded everything: rainfall, soil temperature, germination dates, plant height, number of damaged leaves. He even marked 10 plants in each plot with red string so he could compare the same specimens every week. By late May, the treated plot showed a small advantage. The beans emerged more evenly. The cabbage leaves were broader. The squash vines reached the edge of the rows several days earlier, but Elias had farmed too long to trust early growth. Rich-looking plants could fail during heat, disease, or fruiting. The real test arrived in June. For 19 days, no rain fell. Daytime temperatures climbed above 90 degrees. The creek dropped low enough to expose stones that had been underwater since spring. Nora began feeding hay because her pasture stopped growing. Elias rationed irrigation. Both test plots received the same amount every 4th evening. By the second week, the untreated soil began to crack. The surface formed a hard shell around the cabbage stems. Bean leaves folded during the afternoon and recovered only partly overnight. Several young squash fruits stopped growing. The treated plot also suffered. Elias refused to pretend otherwise. Some leaves wilted. 2 cabbage plants died. Potato beetles damaged 1 row. But beneath the wood chip mulch, the soil stayed cool and slightly moist. Elias pushed a metal probe into both plots at noon. In the untreated plot, it struck resistance after 2 inches. In the treated plot, It entered nearly 6. He dug small inspection holes. The difference was visible. The untreated soil broke apart in dry, angular chunks. The treated soil held together around fine roots, then crumbled when pressed. Earthworms appeared beneath the mulch, along with beetles and white strands of fungal growth connecting the decaying chips to the darker layer below. The compost had not created water. It had helped the soil keep more of what it received. That distinction mattered to Elias. He was not trying to prove that waste had magical properties. He was proving that properly processed organic matter could change how damaged soil behaved. When rain finally came, it arrived too quickly. A summer storm dropped nearly 2 inches in less than an hour. Water rushed from the mill road and crossed the northern field in brown sheets. Elias stood beneath the barn roof and watched the 2 test plots. On the untreated ground, water pooled between the rows and began carrying loose soil downhill. On the treated plot, the mulch slowed the impact of the rain. Water still moved, but not as quickly. More of it disappeared into the soil instead of traveling across the surface. The next morning, Elias measured the damage. 3 untreated rows had shallow erosion channels. Several bean plants had exposed roots. In the treated plot, most of the mulch remained in place. The soil beneath it was wet but not sealed. The planting rows had held. Elias photographed both plots from the same angle. For the first time, the evidence did not depend on his memory or explanation. The difference could be seen in a single frame. One plot was cracked, washed, and thinning. The other was still growing. 2 weeks later, a woman named Maribel Soto arrived in a white van from a food pantry 20 miles away. The restaurant owner had told her about Elias's vegetables. Maribel walked the rows without offering praise. She checked the undersides of cabbage leaves, cut open a potato, and asked what chemicals Elias had used. "Non è so far," he said, "but I'm not promising none forever." She nodded at the answer. Honesty interested her more than purity. The pantry served nearly 400 families each month. Fresh produce was difficult to obtain because donated vegetables arrived irregularly and often spoiled quickly. "How much can you grow?" she asked. Elias looked across the quarter-acre plot. "This year? Not enough. And next year?" He glanced toward the curing piles, the damaged field, and the mill trucks moving beyond the fence. "More than they think." Maribel bought the first harvest at a modest wholesale price. The following Monday, Elias helped load 37 crates of potatoes, cabbage, beans, and squash into her van. It was not food for thousands. Not yet. But when the van pulled away, it carried the first crop grown from land the mill had treated as a disposal site. Elias stood in the road long after it disappeared. The lettuce had been a possibility. The test plots were proof. For the first time, the waste had completed the full journey. From the mill, to the pile, to the soil, to the roots, and finally, into the hands of people who needed food. The letter arrived 3 days after the food pantry collected its second load. It came by certified mail in a white envelope, bearing the mill's name in blue ink. Elias signed for it at the kitchen door, carried it inside, and placed it beside Ruth's notebook. He read it twice. The mill accused him of unauthorized processing and commercial use of company-owned residual material. It demanded that he stop moving, composting, distributing, or profiting from anything delivered by the mill. The wording was careful. For months, the company had called the material harmless residue. Now it called it property. Elias folded the letter and drove into town. The county clerk read it without expression. "Do they have an agreement showing ownership after delivery?" Elias asked. "I can't give legal advice. They dumped it on my field." "I understand. They said it had no value." The clerk slid the letter back across the counter. "You need an attorney." The same attorney Elias had spoken to months earlier still wanted a retainer he could not afford. By the time Elias returned home, Wade Collins was waiting near the access road. The mill supervisor leaned against a black pickup, sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. Behind him, 2 loaded trucks idled beside the gate. "You received the notice?" Wade said. "I did." "Then you understand that this operation stops today." Elias looked toward the curing rows beneath the shed. The finished compost was covered. The fresh material remained separate. Nothing had been taken from the newest loads. "What operation?" "Using mill property for commercial gain." "You left that property on my land." "It was delivered under an existing disposal arrangement." "There is no disposal arrangement. There is an access agreement." "An access agreement is not permission to dump." Wade's jaw tightened. The exchange had repeated so many times that both men knew each line before it was spoken. But something had changed. Before the vegetables, the mill wanted Elias to accept the material as worthless. Now it wanted him to admit the material belonged to the company because it had become useful. Wade pointed toward the compost shed. "You're selling crops grown with our residuals." "I'm selling crops grown in my soil. You wouldn't have that compost without the mill. I wouldn't have damaged pasture without it either." For several seconds, neither man spoke. The truck engines continued idling. A driver stepped down from one cab, then stopped when Wade glanced toward him. Elias unfolded the letter. "This says I'm profiting from your material." "That's correct." "Then it has value." "It may have value when properly processed." "Who processed it?" Wade did not answer. Elias held the letter between them. "You called it waste when it was killing grass? You call it property after I make it useful. You don't get both." Wade stepped closer. "This is not a negotiation." "No," Elias said. "It's a record." He lifted his phone and took a photograph of the 2 trucks, the license plates, and Wade standing beside the gate. For the first time, the drivers did not enter. Wade ordered them back to the mill. The road fell silent. Elias should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt the weight of the problem more clearly than before. Stopping the trucks did not remove the material already on his land. It did not prove what every load contained. It did not protect the well or establish who would pay for damaged soil. And if the mill decided to sue, Elias could lose the farm even while being right. That evening, he spread every document across the kitchen table. Photographs, temperature records, rainfall notes, soil samples, dates of deliveries, copies of county complaints, receipts from the food pantry. He arranged them chronologically. The story that emerged was simple. The mill had delivered mixed organic material without a clear management plan. Elias had documented both damage and recovery. He had separated questionable material, refused contaminated loads, and used only aged material in controlled trials. What he lacked was independent confirmation. The next morning, Elias called the Agricultural Extension Office at the State University. He explained the waste, the compost, the failed crop, the test plots, and the mill's letter. The agent on the phone asked one question Elias had not expected. "Have you tested the finished compost?" "Only with plants." "That tells you something," she said. "Not enough." 4 days later, an extension specialist named Dr. Lena Price arrived carrying sampling bags, gloves, and a soil probe. She did not begin in the green field. She began at the dump. She sampled fresh sawdust, aged material, runoff sediment, finished compost, treated soil, and untreated soil. She asked where each load came from and whether the mill processed painted wood, treated lumber, glues, or composite panels. Elias could not answer. That concerned her. "Wood-based material can be useful," she said, sealing a sample bag. "But source matters. Process matters. Testing matters." She warned him not to treat every pile as safe simply because some piles decomposed well. Elias appreciated that she did not praise him. She inspected the successful crops and the yellow remains of his first corn trial with equal care. Before leaving, she stood beside the 2 comparison plots. "This is promising," she said, "but promising is not the same as proven." When will we know? When the lab results come back? That afternoon, Wade returned. This time he brought no trucks. He saw the fresh sampling holes and the numbered flags in the field. Who was here? Someone who tests before making claims. Wade looked toward the mill. The company had controlled the story because its paperwork moved faster than Elias's evidence. Now that advantage was disappearing. The mill had wanted him to stop using the waste. Instead, it had forced him to document exactly what the waste had become. The laboratory results did not give Elias a victory. They gave him boundaries. The finished compost contained stable organic matter and nutrient levels suitable for cautious agricultural use. Soil from the treated plot held more moisture and showed better structure than soil from the untreated ground. But the report also confirmed what he feared. Several fresh piles were not ready. One contained excessive salts. Another was unevenly decomposed. Sediment from the runoff zone required additional testing. Dr. Lena Price spread the results across Elias's kitchen table. "You were right about the potential," she said. "But you were also lucky." "Which part?" "That you moved slowly enough to discover your mistakes before expanding them." Elias looked through the window toward the compost rows. For months, he had treated slowness as a weakness caused by age, weak equipment, and lack of money. Now he understood that patience had protected the farm. It had also revealed the next problem. He could produce safe compost from selected material. He could grow food on one restored plot. But one 67-year-old man could not turn every pile, plant every row, wash every vegetable, and deliver food across the county. The system had to grow without becoming careless. He began with Maribel Soto at the food pantry. She did not ask how many acres he hoped to plant. She asked what he could reliably deliver. "Families need food they recognize," she said, "and we need crops that will last longer than 3 days." They planned the next season around potatoes, onions, cabbage, beans, carrots, and winter squash. The restaurant agreed to purchase smaller quantities of lettuce, herbs, mushrooms, and specialty vegetables at a higher price. Those sales would pay for seed, fuel, irrigation repairs, and laboratory testing. Nora Bell continued supplying manure and spoiled bedding. In exchange, Elias provided finished compost for one of her degraded hay fields. A nearby orchard offered leaves, damaged fruit, and clean pruning chips. Elias accepted nothing without a known source. Every load was weighed. Every delivery was recorded. Anything mixed with plastic, treated wood, or unidentified material was rejected. The old dumping ground slowly became a controlled work site. Fresh mill residue remained isolated behind red stakes. Active compost occupied 3 long rows wide enough for the tractor. Curing material stayed beneath cover. Finished compost was stored separately near the planting fields. Elias built a washing station from an old stainless steel sink and a used water tank. Maribel found mismatched harvest crates. The restaurant owner helped purchase a repaired dairy cooler, but equipment did not solve the labor problem. So Maribel organized 2 volunteer mornings each week. Nora's nephew handled the tractor on Saturdays. A retired mechanic repaired the manure spreader in exchange for vegetables. The orchard owner loaned a small trailer during harvest. No one person carried the whole system. That was the point. Elias kept the expansion deliberately small, 1 additional acre, then another, only after the first passed soil and compost tests. By early summer, the restored ground held orderly rows of storage crops. The scale was still modest. But the work no longer stopped when Elias's back forced him indoors. One evening, he stood beside the cooler as volunteers stacked the first full harvest. Potatoes, cabbage, beans, carrots, enough for a pantry delivery, a restaurant order, and seed money for the next planting. The transformation was no longer happening inside one pile or one test plot. It had become a chain. Clean material entered. Unsafe material stopped at the boundary. Compost rebuilt the soil. Different people carried the work forward. The mill had expanded its waste by moving faster. Elias expanded his answer by refusing to. The storm arrived after midnight. Elias woke to rain hammering the metal roof, hard enough to drown out the clock beside his bed. A flash of lightning exposed the northern field through the bedroom window, turning the compost rows, sheds, and mill piles white for a fraction of a second. Then darkness returned. By 2 a.m, water was moving across the farm. Elias dressed, took a flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. The rain struck his face sideways. Beyond the barn, the access road had become a shallow river. Water rushed downhill from the mill property, crossed the old dumping area, and spread toward the lower fields. This was the test he had feared. During dry weather, Elias could control moisture with irrigation, mulch, and careful compost use. A violent storm was different. Water chose its own path. It exposed every low point, every compacted track, every place where the soil could no longer absorb what fell on it. He climbed onto the tractor and drove toward the northern field. The headlights revealed brown water pouring from beneath the newest mill piles. It carried bark fragments, sawdust, and dark sediment into the grass. Near the fence, the runoff moved fast enough to bend metal stakes. Elias stopped at the first drainage channel he had shaped earlier that spring. Instead of running directly toward the vegetable beds, part of the water entered a shallow grassed swale cut across the slope. The swale slowed the flow and spread it along the contour. Straw bales and coarse wood chips placed at the lower edge caught floating debris. The system did not stop the water. It reduced its speed. That difference kept the channel from becoming a trench. Farther downhill, the untreated comparison plot was already failing. Rain struck the bare soil and broke the surface into loose particles. Water gathered between the rows, then cut narrow channels toward the field edge. Several cabbage plants leaned sideways, their roots partly exposed. In the treated plot, the rain hit mulch instead of bare soil. Wood chips shifted, but most remained between the rows. Beneath them, water entered gradually. The soil was saturated, yet its surface had not sealed into a smooth crust. Elias pushed a shovel into the ground. The blade sank easily. At the untreated plot, the top layer was soft mud, but below it the soil remained dense. Water sat on the surface because it could not move downward quickly enough. That was the difference the lab report had described in numbers. Now Elias could see it under lightning. Improved structure did not mean the soil would absorb unlimited rain. It meant the soil had more pathways for water, more organic matter to hold moisture, and more protection against direct impact. The farm was still vulnerable, but it was no longer defenseless. Near dawn, Marcus and Nora arrived in separate trucks. Maribel followed with 2 volunteers from the pantry. No one had been called. They had seen the storm and understood what might be happening. Marcus helped clear bark from the swale inlet. Nora moved cattle away from the lower pasture. Maribel and the volunteers stacked empty harvest crates inside the packing shed and raised seed bags onto pallets. At 6, a section of the mill road collapsed. A surge of water crossed the property line and headed toward the storage shed where cured compost was kept under cover. Elias drove the tractor into the rain and pushed a ridge of coarse chips across the flow. Marcus added straw bales behind it. The barrier held for several minutes, then began leaking at one end. "Open the lower ditch," Elias shouted. "If we do, it'll flood the squash field," Marcus replied. "If we don't, it'll take the compost shed." They cut the ditch. Water turned toward the squash. For 20 minutes, the field disappeared beneath moving brown water. Elias watched vines bend flat under the current. Several pumpkins broke loose and rolled toward the fence. It was not a clean victory. Saving one part of the farm cost him another. By 9 o'clock, the rain weakened. The storm had dropped more water in 7 hours than the farm normally received in several weeks. Elias walked the fields with a notebook, photographing damage before anyone began repairs. The untreated plot had lost visible topsoil. Shallow gullies crossed 3 rows. Nearly a third of the beans were damaged. The treated plot had lost mulch and several plants, but most of the soil remained in place. The squash field had suffered badly. Vines were buried beneath sediment, and standing water covered the lower section. The compost shed survived. The swales held. The packing area remained dry. Near the mill piles, the runoff was worse than anything Elias had recorded before. Dr. Lena Price arrived that afternoon. She took water and sediment samples from 6 locations. Then she walked both comparison plots in silence. At the untreated plot, she measured the depth of the erosion channels. At the treated plot, she lifted the mulch and examined the soil beneath. "This storm does not prove the system can prevent flooding," she said. "I know. But it does show that the managed ground resisted erosion better." Elias looked across the damaged squash field. It didn't save everything. No agricultural system does. The county inspector arrived before sunset. For the first time, he did not begin by reading the mill's paperwork. He stood at the property line and watched runoff draining from the company's piles into Elias's field. He photographed the collapsed road, the sediment line, and the debris caught against the straw barriers. Wade Collins came later. His boots sank into the mud as he approached. "This was an extreme weather event," he said. Elias pointed toward the 2 test plots. The rain fell on both. Wade looked at the erosion channels in the untreated soil. Then, at the mulched rows that still held, he said nothing. The storm had damaged crops, destroyed part of a road, and cost Elias weeks of work. But it had also made the hidden process visible. Bade. Compacted soil had shed water and moved downhill. Soil rebuilt with mature compost. Roots and surface cover had absorbed more and held together longer. The difference was no longer confined to Elias's notebook. The county had photographed it. The extension office had sampled it. And the mill had witnessed it. For months, Elias had argued that the land was changing. After the storm, the land spoke for itself. The first time Maribel used the word thousands, Elias corrected her. They were standing inside the packing shed while volunteers loaded potatoes into blue crates. "We haven't fed thousands," he said. "Not today," Maribel replied. She opened the pantry ledger and turned it toward him. The numbers covered 6 months. School deliveries, church meals, weekly family boxes, emergency food distributions, restaurant orders that helped finance the lower-cost crops. Each line showed a date, destination, crop, weight, an estimated number of servings. Elias had tracked acres, temperatures, rainfall, and compost batches. Maribel had tracked meals. Together, the record showed what neither of them had noticed while working week by week. The farm had passed 10,000 servings before the end of summer. Not 10,000 people at one table. Not one miraculous harvest. 10,000 portions of food delivered through a system that repeated itself. That distinction mattered to Elias. He did not want the story turned into a lie. 1 acre had not suddenly fed an entire town. The farm had expanded gradually. More land had been brought into production. Neighboring growers contributed crops during peak weeks. Pantry kitchens stretched cabbage, beans, potatoes, onions, and squash into soups, stews, and school meals. The strength was not in one oversized vegetable, it was in continuity. Every Monday, food left the farm. Some weeks, the load was small. Other weeks, 3 vehicles arrived. By autumn, the system supported 4 main planting areas. One produced storage crops. Another carried rotating vegetables. A smaller section supplied higher-value herbs, greens, and mushrooms. The 4th rested beneath cover crops that protected the soil and returned organic matter. Nothing stayed productive forever. Elias insisted on that. A field that gave heavily one season needed recovery the next. The compost system expanded too, but more carefully than the crops. Every batch had a number. Every ingredient had a source. Fresh wood residue remained separate until inspected. Manure, spoiled hay, leaves, and vegetable scraps were measured before mixing. Active piles were monitored for heat and moisture. Finished material cured before use. Marcus managed the records. He had become better at reading compost than Elias expected. One morning, he stopped a loader before it emptied a new pile. The material contained painted fragments and pieces of pressed board. Wrong pile, Marcus said. The driver complained that it was mostly clean. Mostly clean isn't clean enough. Elias heard his own words in the answer. The entire load was isolated. That decision cost them time and space, but it protected the fields. The farm's success depended as much on what it rejected as what it accepted. By harvest season, the old northern field no longer resembled a dumping ground. Long beds ran where uncontrolled piles had once covered the grass. Mulched paths separated crops. Compost rows stood beneath simple roofs. Storage bins occupied the far side of the barn. But Elias refused to remove every sign of the past. One original waste pile remained near the fence. It was covered, marked, and untouched. Beside it stood a photograph of the field from 2 years earlier. Yellow grass. Brown runoff. Trucks unloading before sunrise. Visitors often asked why he kept it. So no one confuses recovery with permission, Elias said. The land had improved. That did not make the dumping acceptable. In October, the county organized a public meeting about industrial wood residue and agricultural reuse. The mill sent attorneys and technical representatives. They spoke about sustainable disposal, beneficial use, and community partnerships. Elias listened from the second row. When invited to speak, he carried Ruth's notebook to the front. He did not describe himself as an innovator. He described the failed corn, the sour piles, the questionable loads, the laboratory tests, the storm damage. Then he explained what had worked. Clean wood-based material, carefully selected, balanced with nitrogen, managed for air and moisture, allowed to decompose and cure, tested before field use, and applied at appropriate rates. It wasn't waste becoming food by itself, he said. It took separation, labor, testing, time, and soil that was treated like something alive. No one applauded immediately. That pleased him. They were listening. After the meeting, a school nutrition coordinator approached him. The district wanted more storage vegetables for winter meals. A second pantry asked about weekly deliveries. A neighboring farmer offered 5 acres for a cooperative planting. The demand had grown beyond what Elias's land could supply alone. Instead of expanding recklessly, he formed a small network. Participating farms received tested compost, planting plans, and guaranteed buyers. The pantry coordinated distribution. The restaurant market helped cover operating costs. The school committed to seasonal purchases. The system spread without requiring Elias to own every acre. By the end of the second full season, Maribel updated the ledger. The network had distributed produce used in more than 30,000 meals. Elias stared at the number. He remembered the first basket of lettuce on his kitchen table, small enough to carry with one hand. Now refrigerated trucks left the farm carrying potatoes, cabbage, beans, carrots, onions, squash, greens, and mushrooms to kitchens across the county. Before one delivery, Elias watched children help unload crates behind an elementary school. A boy lifted a crooked carrot and asked where it had come from. Mr. Mercer's farm, a cafeteria worker said. The boy looked toward Elias. Did you grow all of this? Elias shook his head. A lot of people did. That was the truth. The mill had delivered the material. Cattle supplied manure. Restaurants supplied scraps. Microbes and fungi broke down the wood. Farmers rebuilt the soil. Volunteers packed the food. Cooks turned it into meals. Elias had not fed thousands alone. He had built the connection that allowed thousands to be fed. The mill had treated his land as the place where usefulness ended. He had proved it could be where usefulness began again. The mill did not apologize. It changed its language. 3 weeks after the county meeting, Elias received a proposal from the company's legal office. The document described a new beneficial reuse partnership between the mill and local farms. Under the plan, the mill would sort selected wood residuals, provide transport, and support agricultural composting projects throughout the county. Elias's name appeared twice, not as the landowner who had complained, as the farmer whose innovative practices demonstrated the potential of circular resource management. He read the sentence again. Then he carried the proposal outside and showed it to Marcus. "They make it sound like they helped you." Marcus said, "They helped themselves to the story." The offer included money, enough to repair the barn roof, replace the cooler, and clear the remaining bank debt. In exchange, Elias would sign a long-term agreement, accepting approved material from the mill. He would appear in photographs, attend public events, and allow the company to use the farm as a demonstration site. The proposal did not mention the unauthorized dumping. It did not mention dead grass, runoff, the failed county complaints, or the storm. It included a confidentiality clause. Maribel read the document at the kitchen table. Nora stood at the sink with her arms folded. "Dr. Lena Price joined by telephone. You could take the money," Nora said. "Pay off the farm. Still insist on testing. And let them write the history?" Marcus asked. "History doesn't fix roofs," Nora replied. Elias remained silent. The offer was not entirely dishonest. Clean wood residue could be useful. A properly designed program could reduce disposal, build soil, and supply farms with carbon-rich material. The mill had equipment, transportation, and a steady source. What it lacked was trust, and trust could not be added to a contract as easily as manure was added to sawdust. Lena's voice came through the speaker. "The technical model can work," she said, "but only if the source is controlled. Every load is documented. Contamination standards are enforceable, and farmers are allowed to refuse material without penalty. None of that is guaranteed here," Elias said. "No." The proposal gave the mill authority to classify its own material. It required farmers to accept minimum annual volumes. It allowed testing, but only through laboratories selected by the company. Elias had spent 2 years learning that the value of a system lay in its limits. This agreement removed those limits. The next morning, he drove to the mill. Wade Collins met him in a conference room overlooking the loading yard. Through the glass, conveyors moved fresh lumber beneath bright industrial lights. A company attorney sat beside Wade. "We believe this is a generous offer," she said. "It is," Elias replied. Wade seemed relieved. Then Elias placed the unsigned agreement on the table. "But I won't accept it." The attorney's expression did not change. "May I ask why?" "Because you want the farm to prove your material is useful without admitting that your dumping harmed the land. The proposal concerns future cooperation. The future begins with an honest record." Wade leaned forward. "What exactly do you want?" Elias had prepared a list. Independent testing. Full source disclosure. No painted, treated, glued, or composite wood. Written acceptance from each landowner before delivery. No minimum volume requirements. The right to reject any load. Runoff controls at the mill. Compensation for the damaged field. Public access to test results. And no confidentiality clause, covering past dumping. The attorney read the page slowly. These conditions would make the program expensive. So was rebuilding my soil. They may make it impossible. Then it should be impossible. Wade stood and walked toward the window. "You're willing to destroy a countywide program over old grievances?" Elias looked through the glass at the trucks waiting below. "Calling harm old doesn't make it repaired." The meeting ended without agreement. For several days, nothing happened. Then the county released the storm inspection report. It documented uncontrolled runoff from the mill's storage area, sediment movement across the property boundary, and inadequate containment along the collapsed road. The report did not prove every claim Elias had made. It proved enough. The mill was ordered to improve drainage, contain loose material, and submit a formal residual management plan. Dumping on Elias's land could not resume without written permission and regulatory approval. The company appealed part of the order, but it also returned to the table. The second proposal was shorter. Independent testing remained. Farmers could refuse loads. Contaminated material was prohibited. The mill accepted responsibility for transport and source records. There was no publicity requirement. A separate settlement covered part of Elias's soil restoration costs. It was not justice in full. The money could not restore lost seasons or return the nights Ruth's farm had spent under someone else's waste. But the new agreement created something the first one had avoided. Accountability. Elias did not sign alone. Nora signed as a participating farmer. Maribel signed for the Food Network. Lena joined the Technical Review Committee. The county retained enforcement authority. Marcus witnessed the signatures. Before putting pen to paper, Elias added one final sentence. No material shall be considered beneficial until its safety, source, and intended use have been independently verified. The attorney objected to the wording. Elias left it in. A month later, the first approved load arrived. The driver stopped at the gate. He handed Marcus a manifest listing the source, material type, weight, and inspection record. Marcus checked the truck, opened the side panel, and examined the load before directing it to the fresh carbon area. No one entered before permission was given. No one dumped before the material was inspected. Elias watched from beside the old untouched pile near the fence. The truck looked almost identical to the ones that had arrived before sunrise 2 years earlier. But this time, the difference was not in the sawdust. It was in who had the right to decide.